And in game number 1, we have Fabiano Caruana versus Magnus Carlsen from their epic 2018 World Championship match. Now in the game, Fabiano Caruana opens 1e4, best by test, and of course Magnus Carlsen responds 1c5, the Sicilian defense. This is what he prepared for that 2018 World Championship match against Fabiano. Now from here, of course, Magnus is heading for his Sveshnikov Sicilian. That occurs after the moves knight to f3, Fabiano intending d4, heading for an open Sicilian. Here Magnus goes knight to c6, then d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, then next, knight to f6, putting pressure on that pawn on the e4 square. Then Fabiano, knight c3, defends the pawn on e4. And finally, the key Sveshnikov move, e5, breaking in the center. Now, this is a very double-edged idea. Here, after the move knight b5 from white, putting pressure on d6. White already threatens knight d6, therefore d6 from black is forced, guarding that square. Now, of course, that d6 square is being guarded by the bishop and the queen, therefore knight d6 ideas from white are not possible. Now, this is the real starting position of the Sveshnikov Sicilian. Here, black's biggest problem is that square d5. White's knight can easily jump into the d5 square, and if white gets a clamp on that d5 square, he's going to have a great position. On the other hand, black has a lot of assets. For example, that pawn on the e5 square blocks white's pawn on e4. And beyond that, all of his minor pieces in this position have the potential to become extremely active. Now from here, white has two main ways to fight for an opening advantage. One is the older move, bishop g5. Games 3, 4, 5, and 6 are going to focus on that move. It's very, very important. However, to kick things off, we are looking at the modern idea of simply jumping in with the knight to the d5 square with the move knight d5. Now, this move was almost completely forgotten until Fabiano Caruana played it in the 2018 World Championship match against Magnus Carlsen. The idea here is white, of course, is threatening knight to c7. That means black is going to have to chop off that knight on the d5 square right away. Then after knight takes d5, e takes d5, suddenly that d5 square is being occupied by a pawn, and we have a big imbalance in the pawn structure. Here, white has that 4 versus 3 pawn majority on the queen side. Meanwhile, black has the 4 versus 3 pawn majority on the king side. And that means both sides are going to be attacking on opposite sides of the board. White attacking on the queen side where he has that pawn majority, and black attacking on the king side with ideas like f5 and maybe f4 later, launching an attack against the white king. Now, of course, in this position, that knight on the c6 square is being attacked. The knight has to go somewhere. You don't want to drop the knight. And here, Magnus Carlsen has two moves that he likes to play. One is the more solid idea, knight b8, and the other is the more combative, knight to e7. Now, we're going to see both of these moves in this series. First of all, we're going to check out knight b8 as played in this game. Then in game number 2, I'm going to show you how Magnus Carlsen plays the other idea, knight to e7. Now, this move, knight to b8, is the more solid option for black. The knight stays on the queen side where it can help defense against white's coming pressure on this side of the board. Now, here already, black has a big threat. If white wastes a move, say h3, he plays a garbage move, then black is going to want to go a6, driving back the knight. Here, the knight has to go back to a3 or c3, for example, knight to a3, and then black can go a5, again, clamping down on the queen side, and he's going to have a fantastic game. For that reason, in this position right here, white typically plays either a4 or c4, immediately gaining space on the queen side. Now, the benefit of a4 is if black goes a6, then the knight can jump back to the a3 square behind the pawn, and that is definitely to white's benefit in this position. On the other hand, if white goes c4 in this position, c4, and then black goes a6. Here, white has the very strong idea, queen to a4, and here, of course, a takes b5 is not possible as the queen can take the rook on the a8 square. Now, in the game, Fabiano went for the first option. He simply played a4, gaining space on the queen side. That is the standard idea here for white. And now both sides simply develop their bishops and castle. Black going bishop to e7, white bishop e2, then castles for both sides, and finally knight d7, getting the knight to a better square. Perhaps black is going to go knight c5 or knight to f6 in the future. Now here, what is white supposed to do to increase the pressure? Well, he has a few different ideas. The main ideas are a5 and b4. In the game, he goes b4, simply gaining space. If white went a5 instead, then the move a6 from black, followed by f5 would be the idea. Instead, b4 on the board for Fabiano Caruana. Now Magnus a6, driving back the knight. Of course, this pawn move does weaken the b6 square. However, it will take white's knight a while to gain access to it. Perhaps knight a3, then knight c4, and finally knight to b6. So that is something to watch out for in your own games. Now here Fabiano retreats the knight back to the a3 square, and here Magnus gains space on the queen side with the move a5. The idea is to try and break up white's pawn structure on the queen side, and then after that he may follow up with the move f5, although overall f5 immediately was perhaps the stronger move in that position. Now here white takes the pawn on the a5 square, b takes a5. The alternative b5 would not be very good. If white did that, then he's completely giving up control of that c5 square, and it's going to be incredibly hard for white to make any meaningful progress on the queen side. So b takes a5, as played by Fabiano, definitely the best idea. Here Magnus simply takes that pawn on the a5 square, then Fabiano goes knight to c4, putting pressure on the rook, and here Magnus has to retreat the rook to a8. Now here we have a transformation of the pawn structure. Obviously black has the open a file and white has the open b file, which it can use to put pressure on black's position. However, beyond that, of course, black's main idea is to get the attack going on the king side with the move f5 and then later f4. So now here, Fabiano Caruana, bishop e3, putting more pressure on that b6 square. Perhaps he wants to go rook b1 and then knight b6 at some point, so very solid idea. And here Magnus finally gets his attack going on the king side, f5. This is the key move. Of course, now he is threatening the move f4, trying to knock off that bishop from the e3 square. And if he can get that move in, he may be threatening e4 or f3 ideas later. Now here Fabiano goes a5, the last preparatory move. This way, if Magnus Carlsen goes f4 as he did in the game, then the bishop does have access to the b6 square where it won't be hanging. So now, bishop b6 from Fabiano Caruana. Of course, that does put pressure on the queen on the e8 square. And here Magnus simply responds queen to e8, an excellent move. Now that queen has access to the g6 square, and from there it is gaining access to white's king on the king side. Now here, what is Fabiano Caruana supposed to do? Obviously, Magnus Carlsen is gaining in speed on the king side with the pawns on e5 and f4, potentially threatening f3 or queen g6 ideas next. Well, in the game, Fabiano finds a really creative idea, rook to a3. The idea is you're activating the rook on the third rank. Now the rook obviously covers all of these squares on this line. And in the future, the rook can also transfer along the third rank to perhaps b3, c3, maybe even f3 or other squares. Now here, Magnus Carlsen continues the attack with the move queen g6, an excellent move. This move supports the idea of e4 and then f3 later, perhaps just trying to blow open white's king side. So now Fabiano Caruana, he goes bishop c7. This is a very committal idea. Obviously, his idea is to put pressure on that pawn on the d6 square. Now both the bishop and the knight are attacking it. For example, if Magnus Carlsen moves his queen anywhere else, then he will lose control of that d6 square. However, overall, this move is a little bit slow. Perhaps Fabiano should have been doing something to defend his king side. Instead, here Magnus just goes for it with the move e4. Very good idea. Now he's threatening f3 or e3, both of which would be very strong. Now from here, Fabiano, king to h1 is the move, a good idea, getting the king off the g-file where it was located with the black queen. And now here, Magnus Carlsen plays a very interesting idea, b5, expanding on the queen side. You typically don't want to expand on the side of the board where your opponent is stronger, but here Magnus Carlsen has a very specific idea. First of all, that en passant move, a takes b6, is possible, but then after rook takes a3, obviously with the rooks off the board, Fabiano Caruana is going to have a much more difficult time getting pressure on the queen side, so you don't want to do that. Instead, what about the move knight to d2, trying to retreat the knight? Well, that would also be very, very weak. If white does that, knight d2, then black has the idea rook to a7, putting pressure on that bishop. And again, overall, Magnus Carlsen is going to be doing just fine here. So here, Fabiano Caruana finds the key idea for white, knight to b6. The only way through it is forward. You have to jump forward with that knight. And here that knight is putting pressure on the bishop on c8. That is a very, very important attacking piece for black in this position. So of course here Magnus simply has to capture the knight on the b6 square. Knight takes b6, then bishop takes. And here Magnus, how does he continue the attack? He starts with the move queen to g5. Excellent idea. Now that queen does put pressure on the pawn on the d5 square. And it also sets up another very dangerous idea for black at a lot of lines here. That is the King's Indian style idea of rook to f6, then perhaps rook g6 or rook to h6. So just activating the rook along the 6th rank is now possible as the queen no longer occupies that rank. Now, of course, the problem with this move, queen to g5, is it does leave that pawn on the b5 square completely undefended. Here, white does have the option of going bishop takes b5. That is the top computer move. However, it's very understandable why Fabiano did not play that. Here, Magnus Carlsen can simply go rook to f6, again intending rook g6 or rook to h6. And although Fabiano is up a single pawn, Black's attack is looking incredibly scary, especially in an over-the-board game. Now, instead of this, here Fabiano plays an offensive move. He goes for the idea of g3. Now, this is very, very committal on his part. Obviously, this move does weaken the light squares around his kingside. For example, g2, f3, g4, and h3. Now, here, Magnus Carlsen does have the option of going f3 immediately. We may see that later in the game, but first he goes b4, hitting the rook on the a3 square, trying to get that pawn off the vulnerable b5 square. So, excellent idea. Fabiano Caruana goes rook b3, transfer the rook and putting pressure on b4. And here, instead of the immediate f3, which may have been the strongest idea, Magnus jumps in with the bishop to the h3 square, bishop to h3. Now, this position is so important. I do want to show you the ideas behind this move f3, as you may encounter it in your own games. Here, f3 is technically the strongest move, but it's very, very complicated. The computer likes bishop b5 for white, and then rook to f6 for black. The idea is you may want to go rook to h6, then queen to h5, threatening checkmate on the h2 square. The lines are very, very complicated. Here, white does have the ability to defend with ideas like rook g1, then bishop to f1, and that bishop does defend the light squares somewhat. So, this idea of f3, very playable for black, perhaps the strongest move according to the engine. However, it's also very complicated. Instead, in the game, Magnus goes for a much simpler idea, bishop to h3, putting pressure on that rook on the f1 square. Now, white has to go rook g1, of course, setting up bishop to f1 ideas defending. Here, Magnus goes f3, driving the bishop back. The problem with this move order, of course, is after the rook goes to the g1 square, then bishop f1 is possible in one go for Fabiano Caruana. However, overall, Magnus doesn't mind. He simply takes the bishop on the f1 square. Bishop takes f1. Now here, obviously, white has to know which piece to recapture that bishop with. If you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to find the correct move for Fabiano Caruana as white here. Well, I hope you found it. The key move, obviously, is queen takes f1. Instead, if you go rook takes f1, that completely gives up the defense of the king side. Here, the key move for black is queen g4. Then you have to go rook g1, trying to open up that square on f1 for the queen to defend. But then rook to f6 is very, very strong. Black's threatening rook h6, maybe even rook takes h2, sacrificing the pawn. And here it's very difficult for white to defend. Now instead, queen takes f1 on the board for Fabiano Caruana in this position. And the problem with this move, it's not a problem, but the drawback of having to make this move is black can pick up that pawn on the d5 square, and that is what Magnus does. Queen takes d5, Magnus wins a pawn. Then finally, Fabiano wins that pawn on the b square, rook takes b4. Now, this is a good time to slow down and talk strategy. The attack is mostly over for Magnus Carlsen. Yes, he still has that pawn on the f3 square, and that means if he could theoretically get a queen down onto g2, that would be checkmate. However, right now, that is so incredibly well defended by the queen and the rook that is not really a threat. Now, the main imbalance in this position, of course, is Fabiano Caruana's passed pawn on the a5 square. Meanwhile, Magnus does have those central pawns on the D and E files, and if he can get those pawns rolling down the board, that would be incredibly dangerous for white. So let's see how both sides try to maximize their strengths in this position. Here, Magnus going queen to e6, getting the queen out of the way of that pawn on the D file. Great idea. Now, Fabiano, rook b5. Of course, black was threatening d5 ideas with the discovered attack of the bishop on the rook, so Fabiano getting the rook out of the way of the bishop right away. Now, Magnus, bishop d8, trying to offer the trade of bishops, and it does happen. Here, Fabiano, queen e1, then the bishops come off the board. Bishop takes and a takes, and then rook a to b8. Now, that passed pawn is on the b file instead of the a file. Obviously, that is the key imbalance in this position. Here, Magnus has to do everything he can to put pressure on that pawn and stop it from promoting. Now, Fabiano, queen e3, queen c4 for Magnus, putting pressure on that rook on the b5 square. Then rook b2 retreats the rook. And finally, rook b7 from Magnus Carlsen, perhaps setting up rook to b8 ideas, putting more pressure on that pawn on b6. Now here, Fabiano finally gets his other rook into the position, rook d1 on the board, pressuring that pawn on the d6 square. And here, Magnus has a big choice. In the end, he goes straight for a simplification option, queen to e2. The idea, he simply wants those queens off the board, and it's not a bad idea. Here in this position, queen takes e2 is not possible for white. For example, if he does capture that queen takes e2, then f takes e2 is the move. White has to go rook to e1. Of course, rook to e2 simply allows e1 promoting to a queen. That is not possible. However, after rook to e1, then black goes rook takes f2, and here he wins a pawn, and he defends that pawn on the e2 square. Meanwhile, his pawns on the d and e file can start rolling down the board. And overall, this would be extremely dangerous for white here. Now, instead of queen takes e2 in this position right here, Fabiano Caruana finds the best idea. That is rook to e1. Now, of course, the queen has to go somewhere. Magnus takes on e3. The rook takes back on e3. And then d5 defends the pawn on the e4 square. Now here, material is still even. And again, the main imbalance is those queenside pawns for Fabiano versus those central pawns for Magnus. And of course, Magnus still has that pawn on the f3 square, meaning Fabiano does have to defend against various back rank mating ideas. For example, rook a8 to rook a1 would in theory be checkmate if Magnus had two free moves here. So very interesting imbalanced position. Now here, Fabiano Caruana defends against those future back rank mate threats right away with the move h4. Now the king has access to h2, even h3 and g4. That is never going to be a worry. Now Magnus rook c8, putting pressure on that pawn on c2 and stopping c3 or c4 ideas in the future. Now Fabiano, he tries to activate his rook on the a file, rook to a3, solid idea. And then from there, both sides try to bring their kings back into the middle of the board. King f7, king h2, king e6. Then Fabiano expanding on the king side, g4, setting up king g3 and king f4 ideas. And from here, I do want to go through the endgame a little bit faster, as this is not an endgame video. It's mostly a video about Magnus Carlsen and his favorite Sveshnikov variation. So blitzing through, Magnus putting pressure on the pawn, Fabiano defending, and both sides activating their kings, both sides gaining space on the king side. And here Magnus gets in a little bit of trouble with his king d4, a very aggressive looking move. Perhaps king d6 instead would have been a better idea. And here Fabiano Caruana putting pressure on that pawn on the d5 square, stopping the future advance of king c3, for example. And now from here, despite all the tension on the queen side with the rooks and the pawns, the game mostly fizzles out to a draw. A bunch of pieces start to get traded off. The pawns come off the board. The rooks come off the board. And then in this position right here, both players agree to a draw on move 54, as there is simply no way for white to make meaningful progress in this position. Magnus Carlsen, of course, is the greatest endgame player of all time, and that extra pawn for Fabiano is simply not going to be enough here. Wow, what a game from both players.